The radar signature appeared at 3:47 hours, 30,000 feet above the Nevada desert, moving at subsonic speed toward restricted airspace. What caught Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Vega's attention wasn't the blip itself. Unidentified aircraft triggered alerts daily along the test range perimeter. It was the flight pattern. The craft traced perfect figure eights, each loop precisely timed, altitude constant to the foot. No commercial pilot flew like that. No military pilot would dare. Tower Ghost Lead, Vega's voice crackled through the communications array at Nellis Air Force Base. I'm tracking an unknown contact, bearing 270, range 40 nautical miles. Flight profile is unusual. The response came immediately from Senior Airman Rodriguez in the control tower. Ghost Lead, we show nothing on primary radar. Transponder off. Authorization to investigate. Within minutes, two F-22 Raptors screamed across the tarmac, their Pratt and Whitney engines carving thunder from the pre-dawn silence. Vega's wingman, Captain Tyler Frost Kellerman, tucked into formation as they climbed toward the mysterious contact. The stealth fighter's angular profiles cut through darkness like predatory shadows. Ghost 2, you seeing this? Vega's heads-up display painted the target ahead, a single-engine aircraft, impossibly steady in its repetitive dance across the sky. Negative visual yet lead, but that pattern, Kellerman's voice trailed off. Something about those loops nagged at him, triggered a half-formed memory from flight school. As they closed distance, the desert floor 30,000 feet below stretched endlessly, painted silver by moonlight. The target aircraft came into view, a modified P-51 Mustang, its polished aluminum skin reflecting starlight. World War II vintage, but the engine modifications were clearly modern. Whoever piloted this machine knew aircraft intimately. Unknown aircraft, this is United States Air Force. You are entering restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately and alter course to heading 090. Silence answered them. The Mustang continued its methodical pattern, neither acknowledging their presence nor deviating from its course. Vega maneuvered closer, his F-22's sophisticated sensors analyzing every rivet on the vintage fighter's frame. Through his canopy, he could see the pilot, slight build, steady hands on the controls. The figure wore what appeared to be an original flight jacket, leather worn smooth by decades of use. Ghost Lead to tower, requesting background check on any missing aircraft. This pilot's not responding, but they're maintaining precise formation parameters. Doesn't feel hostile. The radio crackled with static before Rodriguez responded. Ghost Lead, cross-referencing stolen aircraft reports now. Maintain observation distance. We're scrambling additional units. But Kellerman was studying something else entirely. Those figure eights weren't random. The precision, the timing, the deliberate repetition. He'd seen this before, years ago, in grainy training footage. His pulse quickened as recognition dawned. Lead, he called softly. I think I know what we're looking at. The Mustang banked into another perfect loop, and in that moment everything changed. This wasn't an intruder. This was a message written across the sky in aluminum and aviation fuel, penned by someone who understood that certain truths could only be told at altitude, where the earth fell away and heaven pressed close. Someone who knew that the best stories began with a single aircraft, alone against the infinite blue, carrying secrets that demanded to be shared. Dawn was breaking across the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold. In that growing light, the Mustang's polished skin gleamed like a beacon, and the two F-22 pilots realized they were witnessing something extraordinary, a ghost returning from decades of silence, demanding to be heard. The vintage fighter maintained its pattern, waiting, always waiting. 2 hours earlier, Chief Master Sergeant Lucia Kit Ramirez had wheeled the restored P-51D from its hangar in Reno, Nevada. Her hands trembled slightly as she performed the pre-flight inspection, not from fear, but from anticipation. 57 years old, silver-haired, with calloused fingers that spoke of decades working aircraft maintenance, she moved around the Mustang with practiced efficiency. This particular aircraft held stories that stretched back to her grandfather's war, tales that had shaped her understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the thin line between legend and truth. The Mustang bore no military markings, no identifying numbers, just polished aluminum and the ghost of old paint where squadron insignia had once proclaimed allegiance to units that existed now only in history books and aging veterans' memories. Kit had spent 3 years restoring this machine, not for museums or air shows, but for this single mission. Tonight, she would fly it one last time, carrying a message that demanded delivery at 30,000 feet. Her flight suit was vintage too, leather jacket worn by her grandmother during World War II, when women pilots ferried bombers across the Atlantic and tested experimental fighters that killed more test pilots than enemy action. The jacket's patches told stories of the women Air Force service pilots, the WASP program that trained over 1,000 female aviators before military bureaucracy disbanded them and erased their contributions from official records. Kit's own military career had begun in 1985, when women pilots were still curiosities in fighter squadrons. She'd flown F-16s in Desert Storm, A-10s in Bosnia, and F-15Es in Afghanistan. 28 years of active duty, 2 distinguished flying crosses, and a reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home when other pilots would have ejected. Her call sign, Kit, came from her ability to fix anything mechanical with whatever tools were available, a skill learned in her father's garage, perfected in combat zones where backup never came fast enough. But tonight's flight wasn't about her record or achievements. It was about justice delayed, honor denied, and a promise made to dying veterans who'd carried secrets too heavy for civilian shoulders to bear. The figure-8 pattern she'd chosen wasn't random navigation. It was the International Aeronautical Signal for Distress, repeated endlessly to ensure reception. She was broadcasting a message to anyone with eyes to see and knowledge to interpret. Something was wrong, something needed attention, something demanded witness. The Mustang's Merlin engine purred with modified power as she taxied toward the runway. Behind her, in the aircraft's stripped cargo compartment, lay a metal briefcase containing documents that would rewrite military history if their contents became public. Testimonies from dead pilots, classified mission reports, and evidence of systematic discrimination that had cost lives and buried heroism beneath layers of institutional bias. Kit advanced the throttle, feeling 1,200 horsepower respond with eager violence. The runway lights blurred past as the vintage fighter gathered speed, its modern modifications transforming historical artifact into capable machine. At rotation speed, she pulled back gently, and the Mustang leaped skyward with surprising grace, climbing into darkness toward an appointment with 2 F-22 pilots who had no idea they were about to become part of something larger than routine intercept protocol. 30,000 feet above Nevada, she began her patient dance, tracing messages across the sky while waiting for someone to recognize the signal and understand its meaning. The desert spread below like a moonlit ocean, empty and eternal, witness to her solitary vigil. Ghost lead closed within 500 feet of the Mustang, close enough to read the wear patterns on its propeller blades, and note the subtle modifications that marked this as no ordinary restored warbird. The pilot inside maintained steady course and altitude, hands visible on the controls, clearly non-threatening but equally determined to continue the repetitive flight pattern. Tower Ghost lead. Target appears to be vintage P-51 Mustang, single occupant, no visible weapons. Pilot is maintaining strict formation discipline but refusing communication. Senior Airman Rodriguez's voice carried new tension. Ghost lead, we've completed database searches. No reported stolen aircraft matching that description. No flight plan filed. This bird isn't supposed to exist. Kellerman was studying the pilot through his targeting system's high-resolution optics. Something about the figure's posture, the way hands rested on the controls, triggered deeper recognition. Lead, zoom in on that flight jacket. Look at the patches. Vega maneuvered closer, his F-22's sensors capturing every detail. The leather jacket was clearly vintage, worn smooth by decades of use. Multiple patches covered the left breast, squadron insignia, service ribbons, and something else. A silver pin shaped like wings, but not standard Air Force issue. The design was older, simpler, carrying the austere elegance of wartime manufacturing. "Those are Wasp wings," Kellerman said quietly. "Women Air Force service pilots, World War II program." The radio fell silent as both F-22 pilots processed this information. The WASP program had been classified for decades. Its participants denied military status despite flying the same missions and facing the same risks as their male counterparts. These women had test-flown experimental aircraft, ferried bombers across oceans, and trained male pilots for combat, all while being classified as civilian contractors with no benefits, no recognition, no place in official military history. Ghost 2, are you thinking what I'm thinking? That we're looking at someone with a story to tell. Yeah, lead. Question is, why here, why now, and why won't she respond to radio calls? The Mustang completed another figure eight, precise as atomic clockwork. The pilot showed no signs of fatigue despite hours of repetitive maneuvering. This was someone accustomed to long flights, comfortable with solitude at altitude, patient enough to wait for the right audience to recognize the message being transmitted through pure flight discipline. Vega made a decision that would alter the trajectory of all three pilots' lives. Instead of maintaining observation distance, he moved his F-22 into loose formation beside the Mustang, matching speed and heading. The action violated standard intercept protocol, but something about this situation demanded flexibility, understanding, recognition of deeper currents flowing beneath surface procedures. The elderly pilot turned toward his aircraft, and for the first time Vega saw her face clearly. Hispanic features weathered by decades of wind and sun, silver hair pulled back severely, dark eyes that held stories of combat zones and classified missions. She raised one hand from the controls, not in surrender but in acknowledgement. A pilot's greeting, one professional to another. Then she pointed downward, toward the briefcase secured in her cockpit, and mouthed words that Vega's lip-reading training parsed clearly. "Listen to the radio. Ghost lead to tower. Request permission to switch to emergency frequency. I think our visitor wants to communicate on different channel." The authorization came immediately. Both F-22 pilots adjusted their radios to 121.5 MHz, the international emergency frequency monitored by all aircraft. Static filled their headsets for long moments before a woman's voice broke through, calm and professionally modulated despite the emotional weight behind her words. "United States Air Force Interceptors, this is Chief Master Sergeant Lucia Ramirez, retired. Call sign Kit. I am conducting this unauthorized flight to draw attention to classified materials in my possession. Materials that document systematic discrimination and honor denied to female military pilots over the past 70 years. Her transmission continued with military precision, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact and minimum ambiguity. "I am not surrendering. I am not fleeing. I am testifying. The documents in my aircraft contain evidence of missions flown in combat zones by women pilots whose service was classified, minimized, or completely erased from official records. Some of these women died for their country and received no recognition. Others survived decades of institutional bias and were denied promotions, assignments, and honors given to male pilots with identical or inferior records." The two F-22 pilots listened in growing amazement as Kit's story unfolded across the emergency frequency. She spoke of her grandmother, who had ferried B-17 bombers across the Atlantic in 1943 and died in a training accident that was never officially investigated. Of her own service in Desert Storm, where she'd flown close air support missions that saved ground units but were credited to male pilots in official reports. Of countless female aviators whose achievements had been systematically minimized or attributed to others. I have been attempting to bring these issues to official attention through proper channels for 15 years. Every inquiry has been buried, every document request denied, every appeal rejected. The women whose stories I carry deserved better from the institution they served with distinction. Tonight, I fly their mission one final time. Kellerman's voice was subdued as he responded. Kit, this is Ghost 2, we're listening. But unauthorized penetration of restricted airspace isn't going to solve anything. You're looking at serious federal charges. Kit's laugh carried no humor, only bitter understanding of military bureaucracy's limitations. Captain, I'm 57 years old with terminal pancreatic cancer. 6 months to live, maybe 8 if I'm unlucky. Federal prison doesn't scare me. What scares me is dying with these stories untold and these heroes unrecognized. The admission hit both F-22 pilots like physical blows. This wasn't reckless protest or attention-seeking stunt. This was a dying veteran making one final stand for principles that had guided her entire adult life. The figure-8 pattern wasn't surrender. It was persistence, the mathematical representation of infinity, a promise to continue circling until someone with authority to act finally paid attention. Dawn was breaking across the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In that growing light, 3 aircraft maintained formation 30,000 feet above the Nevada desert. 2 state-of-the-art stealth fighters worth $150 million each, and a 70-year-old restored fighter carrying priceless stories of courage, sacrifice, and honor denied. The morning shift was arriving at Nellis Air Force Base when Senior Airman Rodriguez received a priority call from the Pentagon. Colonel Patricia Hayes, Deputy Director of Military Personnel Policy, had been monitoring the situation through encrypted channels and now demanded immediate connection to the flight leader. Ghost Lead, this is Colonel Hayes, Pentagon. Patch me through to the unauthorized aircraft immediately. Vega's training warred with instinct as he processed the order. Standard protocol demanded he maintain separation from potentially hostile contacts, not facilitate communication between unauthorized pilots and senior Defense Department officials. But everything about this situation had transcended standard protocol from the moment Kit began tracing her patient messages across the sky. Colonel Hayes, Ghost Lead. Be aware that the pilot claims to possess classified materials documenting discrimination against female military personnel. She's requesting official audience for these materials. Patch me through, Lieutenant Colonel. That's an order. The encrypted communication link established within seconds, allowing Colonel Hayes direct access to Kit's radio frequency. The connection crackled with official authority as the Pentagon official's voice cut through static. Chief Master Sergeant Ramirez, this is Colonel Patricia Hayes, Deputy Director of Military Personnel Policy. You are ordered to land immediately at Nellis Air Force Base and surrender any classified materials in your possession. Kit's response carried decades of experience dealing with military bureaucracy's inflexibility. Colonel Hayes, with respect, I have been attempting to bring these materials to official attention through proper channels for 15 years. Every inquiry has been dismissed, every document request denied. I am conducting this flight to ensure these stories receive the attention they deserve. Sergeant Ramirez, I understand your frustration, but unauthorized flight in restricted airspace will not advance your cause. Land immediately, and we will discuss these materials through appropriate channels. The exchange that followed would be studied in military leadership courses for decades afterward. a masterclass in how institutional inertia collided with individual conscience at 30,000 feet. Kit's voice remained professionally calm as she outlined the scope of her documentation. 17 female pilots whose combat achievements had been attributed to male squadron mates, 8 women who had died in classified missions, but were listed as training accidents in official records, and 43 cases of qualified female pilots denied assignments or promotions that went to less experienced male officers. Colonel, these women served with distinction and died with honor. They deserve recognition for their sacrifice. The families of KIA pilots deserve to know their daughters died serving their country, not in training accidents. The institutional discrimination documented in these files has cost the military talented officers and compromised operational effectiveness. Colonel Hayes's tone shifted subtly as she processed the implications of Kit's revelations. Sergeant, if these materials contain evidence of systematic discrimination, they will be investigated through proper channels, but threatening to release classified information will not expedite that process. Ma'am, I'm not threatening anything. I'm testifying. These stories belong to the American people, and these heroes deserve recognition. If proper channels had worked, I wouldn't be conducting this flight. The communication link fell silent as Colonel Hayes conferred with superiors whose names would never appear in official reports. Miles below, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly, indifferent to human struggles for justice and recognition. Above, 3 aircraft maintained formation while institutional machinery ground slowly toward decisions that would affect military policy for generations. Ghost Lead and Ghost 2 had become unwilling witnesses to something larger than routine intercept protocol, a confrontation between individual conscience and institutional inertia that played out against the infinite backdrop of desert sky. The sun climbed higher, burning away morning shadows and illuminating the stark beauty of aircraft in formation, carrying stories that demanded to be heard. Inside the Pentagon's Secure Communications Center, Colonel Hayes faced a decision that would define her career and potentially reshape military personnel policy. The documents Kit carried represented either the ramblings of a disgruntled veteran or evidence of systematic discrimination that had operated for decades beneath official oversight. The only way to determine which was to examine the materials personally. But authorizing that examination meant acknowledging the legitimacy of Kit's unauthorized flight, setting a precedent that could encourage other veterans to seek attention through dramatic gestures. Hayes weighed the risks of appearing to negotiate with someone who had violated federal airspace against the potential consequences of ignoring evidence of institutional discrimination. The decision came from higher authority. General Marcus Stone, the Air Force Chief of Staff, had been briefed on the situation and recognized its potential to become a public relations disaster if mishandled. His orders were clear: get the materials, conduct a thorough investigation, and ensure that any legitimate grievances were addressed through official channels. Sergeant Ramirez, you have my word that these materials will receive thorough investigation by appropriate authorities. But you must land immediately and surrender the documents through proper chain of command. Kit's response revealed the depth of her skepticism toward military promises. Colonel, I have heard similar assurances for 15 years. Each time the investigation was delayed, the documents were classified at higher levels and the stories were buried deeper. These women's service records speak for themselves. They earned the right to be remembered as heroes, not footnotes in classified files. The standoff continued as morning advanced toward noon. Kit maintained her figure-8 pattern with mechanical precision, burning fuel that would eventually force a landing, but showing no signs of fatigue or doubt. The 2 F-22 pilots remained in loose formation, increasingly sympathetic to her cause but bound by military discipline to follow orders. Senior Airman Rodriguez monitored the situation from Nellis Air Force Base, where media vehicles had begun gathering outside the main gate. Word of the unauthorized flight had leaked through unofficial channels, and reporters were demanding information about the elderly pilot who had penetrated restricted airspace and refused to surrender. The story was spreading through social media, transforming from military incident to national controversy within hours. Ghost Lead Tower. Be advised we have media presence on base perimeter. This situation is going public. The announcement changed everything. What had begun as routine intercept protocol was now unfolding under potential national scrutiny. Colonel Hayes understood that every decision made in the next few hours would be analyzed, criticized, and second-guessed by military historians, legal experts, and political commentators. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Captain Kellerman, studying the Mustang through his targeting system, noticed something that had escaped earlier observation. The vintage fighter's tail section bore faded stencil marks, barely visible letters and numbers that appeared to be military serial numbers from World War II. Ghost Lead, I'm seeing something on the tail section. Looks like military markings, barely visible. This aircraft might have military provenance. The revelation added new complexity to an already complicated situation. If the Mustang was military property, even decommissioned military property, Kit's flight might constitute theft of government assets in addition to airspace violations. But it also suggested that her connection to military aviation extended beyond personal service to historical preservation. Research teams at Nellis Air Force Base began tracing the aircraft's history through wartime production records, searching for connections between serial numbers and operational history. What they discovered would transform understanding of not just Kit's mission, but the systematic erasure of women's contributions to military aviation during World War II. The P-51D Mustang, flying in formation with two F-22 Raptors, had been manufactured in 1944 and assigned to the Air Transport Command for delivery to European theater operations. But instead of being ferried by male pilots, it had been flown across the Atlantic by Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a WASP pilot whose service record had been classified and whose death in a 1945 training accident had never been properly investigated. Kit was flying her grandmother's aircraft on her grandmother's final mission, carrying evidence that would finally give voice to women whose stories had been buried beneath decades of institutional indifference. The figure-8 pattern wasn't just distress signal, it was memorial service, conducted at altitude where her grandmother's spirit could finally find peace. The Mustang's Merlin engine continued its steady drone as Kit maintained course and heading, patient as the desert itself, waiting for institutional machinery to grind toward justice delayed but not denied. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had been 23 years old when she died at the controls of a P-51D Mustang during what official records classified as a routine training flight. The aircraft had crashed in a thunderstorm over West Texas, killing Chen instantly and burying her story beneath layers of wartime censorship and institutional indifference. Her family had been told she died serving her country, but the details remained classified for 70 years. Kit had discovered her grandmother's true story through painstaking research in military archives, tracking down classified documents that revealed the systematic minimization of female pilots' contributions during World War II. Sarah Chen hadn't died in a training accident. She had been ferrying a damaged P-51 to a repair facility when mechanical failure forced her to attempt an emergency landing during severe weather. Radio transcripts revealed her desperate attempts to save the aircraft and return it to service, fighting control failures and engine problems while guiding the fighter toward the nearest airfield. Her final transmission, preserved in classified files, demonstrated the courage and skill that had characterized her entire service record. Tower, this is WASP 77. Engine failure, hydraulics gone, controls sluggish. I'm going to try to put her down at auxiliary field. If I don't make it, tell them I brought her home as far as I could. The investigation that followed Sarah Chen's death had been perfunctory, designed to minimize publicity rather than determine causes. Her service record was classified, her achievements attributed to male pilots in squadron reports, and her family was told only that she had died in service to her country. The P-51 she had fought to save was eventually recovered, repaired, and assigned to combat operations in Europe, where it compiled a distinguished service record under male pilots who received credit for missions that Sarah Chen's skill and sacrifice had made possible. Kit had spent 3 years restoring that same P-51, researching its history and documenting the systematic erasure of her grandmother's achievements. Every rivet replaced, every component rebuilt, every system restored to wartime specifications had been an act of memorial, a granddaughter's promise to ensure that Sarah Chen's story would not remain buried in classified files. The briefcase secured in the Mustang's cockpit contained more than bureaucratic documentation. It held Sarah Chen's personal flight log, photographs of WASP pilots who had served with distinction, and letters from families who had never learned the truth about their daughter's service and sacrifice. These materials represented 70 years of institutional silence that Kit was determined to break, one way or another. "Colonel Hayes, this is Kit. I want you to understand something. This isn't about one old woman's grievances or even systematic discrimination against female pilots. This is about honor. These women earned the right to be remembered as heroes, not footnotes. Sarah Chen died trying to save a P-51 Mustang that went on to serve with distinction in combat. Her skill and sacrifice made possible the missions that male pilots received credit for. She deserves recognition for her service and honor for her sacrifice." The radio fell silent as Pentagon officials processed the emotional weight behind Kit's mission. This wasn't protest or publicity stunt. It was memorial service conducted at 30,000 feet, where the boundaries between earth and heaven dissolved and truth could be spoken without institutional interference. Ghost Lead maintained formation beside the Mustang, increasingly moved by the story unfolding through encrypted communications. Both F-22 pilots understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a veteran's final stand for principles that transcended military regulations and bureaucratic procedures. "Kit, this is Ghost Lead. For what it's worth, I think your grandmother would be proud of what you're doing." The acknowledgement from a fellow pilot carried more weight than official commendations or Pentagon promises. It represented recognition from one professional to another, validation of the courage required to challenge institutional inertia and demand justice for forgotten heroes. The sun reached its zenith as 3 aircraft continued their patient dance above the Nevada desert, carrying stories that demanded witness and heroes who refused to remain silent. The Pentagon's crisis management team had assembled in the Secure Communications Center, monitoring a situation that threatened to become a national controversy with international implications. General Marcus Stone reviewed intelligence reports, while Colonel Hayes coordinated with legal experts and public affairs officers, all attempting to balance military discipline with public relations concerns. The media presence outside Nellis Air Force Base had grown from local news crews to national network correspondents, attracted by social media posts describing an elderly female veteran who had penetrated restricted airspace to challenge military discrimination. The story was spreading rapidly through online channels, with hashtags like Fly Her Home and Women Warriors trending on multiple platforms. "Sir, we have a problem," Colonel Hayes reported to General Stone. "The unauthorized pilot is terminally ill and claims to possess evidence of systematic discrimination spanning 7 decades. If we handle this poorly, we're looking at congressional hearings and international scrutiny of military personnel policies." General Stone understood the implications immediately. The Department of Defense had spent years improving gender integration and addressing historical inequities in military service. A public confrontation with a dying veteran carrying evidence of institutional discrimination could undermine decades of progress and provide ammunition for critics of military culture. But authorizing negotiation with an unauthorized pilot would set a dangerous precedent, encouraging other grievance holders to seek attention through dramatic gestures that violated federal airspace and compromised national security. The decision required balancing competing priorities, maintaining military discipline while acknowledging legitimate concerns about historical injustices. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Captain Tyler Kellerman, monitoring the situation from his F-22's cockpit, recognized something that had escaped official attention. The figure-8 pattern Kit maintained wasn't just distress signal. It was precise mathematical representation of infinity, the international symbol for continuity without end. Tower, Ghost 2. I think I understand what she's trying to tell us. The flight pattern she's maintaining represents infinity, eternal continuation. She's saying these stories will continue circling until someone with authority to act finally pays attention. The interpretation added symbolic dimension to Kit's mission that resonated with Pentagon officials struggling to find face-saving solutions to an increasingly complex situation. If they could frame her flight as memorial tribute rather than unauthorized penetration of restricted airspace, public relations concerns might be minimized, while legitimate grievances received appropriate attention. General Stone made a decision that would influence military personnel policy for generations. Instead of treating Kit as a security threat, the Pentagon would recognize her as a veteran conducting memorial service for forgotten heroes. The shift in perspective changed everything, from criminal prosecution to honor guard, from security incident to historical documentation project. Colonel Hayes informed Sergeant Ramirez that the Department of Defense acknowledges the service and sacrifice of all veterans who served with distinction, regardless of gender or historical recognition. We are prepared to receive her materials and conduct thorough investigation of any evidence regarding systematic discrimination. The official acknowledgement represented more than bureaucratic language. It was institutional recognition of Kit's mission and validation of the heroes whose stories she carried. The Pentagon was agreeing to listen, to investigate, and to act on evidence that had been ignored for decades. Kit's response carried a mixture of relief and skepticism born from 15 years of bureaucratic stonewalling. General Stone, I appreciate your assurance, but I need more than promises. I need commitment to full investigation, public release of findings, and appropriate recognition for the women whose service has been minimized or erased. The negotiation that followed would establish precedent for how military institutions address historical injustices and veteran grievances. Kit demanded specific timelines for investigation, public hearings on discrimination findings, and memorial recognition for WASP pilots whose service had been classified or minimized. Pentagon officials weighed these demands against institutional interests, seeking solutions that addressed legitimate concerns while maintaining military discipline. The sun began its descent toward western mountains as 3 aircraft maintained formation above the Nevada desert, carrying forward a conversation between individual conscience and institutional responsibility that would reshape military culture for generations to come. Inside the Pentagon's Crisis Management Center, legal experts huddled over precedent studies, while public affairs officers crafted statements that would satisfy both veteran advocacy groups and congressional oversight committees. The unauthorized flight had evolved from security incident to national conversation about military culture, historical justice, and institutional accountability. Senior Airman Rodriguez monitored communications from Nellis Air Force Base, where media presence had attracted protesters demanding recognition for female veterans and counter-protesters supporting military discipline. The situation was acquiring political dimensions that transcended Kit's original mission, transforming personal testimony into national debate about military values and institutional reform. Ghost Lead Tower. Be advised we have congressional staffers requesting briefings on the situation. This is becoming a political issue. The announcement confirmed what Pentagon officials had feared. Kit's unauthorized flight was catalyzing broader discussions about military culture that could affect defense budgets, personnel policies, and public support for military institutions. Every decision made in the next few hours would be scrutinized by congressional committees, veteran advocacy groups, and international observers monitoring American military justice. Colonel Hayes faced a choice that would define her career and potentially influence military personnel policy for decades. She could continue treating Kit as a security threat, risking public relations disaster and congressional investigation, or she could embrace the opportunity to address historical injustices and demonstrate institutional commitment to veteran welfare. The decision came from understanding that institutions gain strength by acknowledging mistakes and addressing grievances, not by suppressing dissent and defending past errors. The Pentagon would conduct the investigation Kit demanded, release findings publicly, and implement reforms necessary to prevent future discrimination. Sergeant Ramirez, you have the commitment you requested. Full investigation with public findings, timeline for completion within 6 months, and memorial recognition for all WASP pilots whose service has been classified or minimized. In return, you will land immediately at Nellis Air Force Base and surrender materials through proper chain of command. Kit's silence stretched across several minutes as she processed the implications of Pentagon promises. 15 years of stonewalling had taught her skepticism toward military assurances, but the public nature of current negotiations provided accountability mechanisms that previous discussions had lacked. Media attention and congressional interest meant that Pentagon commitments would be scrutinized and enforced by external oversight. General Stone, I accept your commitment with one additional condition. I want to present these materials personally to congressional committees investigating military discrimination. These women's stories deserve to be heard by the people's representatives, not buried in classified briefings. The demand escalated stakes beyond Pentagon comfort levels. Congressional testimony would subject military personnel policies to public scrutiny and political oversight that could result in mandated reforms, budget restrictions, and leadership changes. But refusing Kit's demand would appear to validate her claims about institutional cover-ups and systemic discrimination. General Stone understood that agreeing to congressional testimony represented more than procedural concession. It was institutional acknowledgement that military justice required external oversight and public accountability. The decision would establish precedent for future grievance procedures and demonstrate Pentagon commitment to transparency in addressing historical injustices. Agreed, Sergeant Ramirez. You will have opportunity to present materials to appropriate congressional committees. Now please land immediately so we can begin the investigation these heroes deserve. The agreement reached across encrypted communications, represented victory for principles that had guided Kit's entire adult life. Accountability, transparency, and recognition for service members whose contributions had been minimized or forgotten. Her grandmother's stories would finally receive the attention they deserved, and institutional changes would prevent future discrimination against qualified military personnel. The P-51 Mustang banked slowly toward Nellis Air Force Base as Kit prepared for landing after nearly 12 hours of flight. The figure-8 pattern dissolved into standard approach procedures as 3 aircraft descended through morning air toward a conclusion that validated courage, honored sacrifice, and demanded justice. The landing sequence unfolded with ceremonial precision that acknowledged the historical significance of Kit's mission. Nellis Air Force Base had arranged honor guard protocols typically reserved for visiting dignitaries, recognizing that this unauthorized flight had evolved into something larger than security incident. It had become memorial service for forgotten heroes and catalyst for institutional reform. Ground crews positioned themselves along the runway as the vintage P-51 Mustang touched down with smooth precision that demonstrated Kit's decades of aviation experience. The aircraft rolled to a stop near the control tower, its Merlin engine winding down with the satisfied sigh of machinery that had completed its mission. Emergency vehicles waited at respectful distance, more honor guard than security response. Ghost Lead and Ghost 2 landed immediately afterward, their F-22 Raptors forming an informal escort as all three aircraft taxied toward the designated parking area. The symbolism was deliberate, two state-of-the-art stealth fighters acknowledging the vintage warbird that had carried forward stories demanding recognition and justice. Kit remained in the cockpit for several minutes after shutdown, gathering strength for confrontations that would determine whether her grandmother's sacrifice would finally receive appropriate recognition. The briefcase containing documented evidence of systematic discrimination rested beside her seat, heavier with historical significance than its actual weight suggested. When she finally emerged from the restored P-51, the waiting delegation included Colonel Hayes, Base Commander Brigadier General Robert Martinez, and representatives from veteran advocacy organizations who had driven through the night to witness this moment. Media personnel remained at controlled distance, but their presence ensured that subsequent proceedings would unfold under public scrutiny. Chief Master Sergeant Ramirez, Colonel Hayes stepped forward with formal military bearing. Thank you for bringing these materials to official attention. We are prepared to receive them and begin the investigation you have requested. The ceremonial transfer of documents occurred on the tarmac, beside the aircraft that had carried them across decades of institutional silence. Kit opened the briefcase carefully, revealing meticulously organized files that represented years of research and documentation. Each folder contained stories of individual women whose service had been classified, minimized, or attributed to male colleagues. Colonel, these materials document systematic discrimination that affected hundreds of qualified female military personnel over 7 decades. The evidence speaks for itself, but I want to emphasize that these women served with distinction and died with honor. They earned recognition as heroes, not footnotes in classified files. The files passed from Kit's weathered hands to Colonel Hayes's gloved fingers with solemnity appropriate to their historical significance. Congressional staffers photographed the transfer, while veteran advocacy representatives ensured that media coverage captured the moment when institutional silence was finally broken by individual courage. But the most meaningful exchange occurred between two pilots who understood the deeper significance of Kit's mission. Lieutenant Colonel Vega approached the elderly veteran with respect earned through shared understanding of aviation's demands and military services obligations. Ma'am, on behalf of all military aviators, thank you for carrying these stories forward. Your grandmother would be proud. The acknowledgement from a fellow pilot carried more weight than official commendations or bureaucratic promises. It represented validation from one professional to another, recognition of the courage required to